Chapter 6, QB Point. The day was shining for a change. I gathered up 2 fat suitcases and motioned for a jeepney on Magsaysay Boulevard. These were my possessions inside the Philippines, plus the accumulations of the months in Vietnam: clothes, legal papers, some souvenirs. I crammed the bags into the passenger space, displacing a couple of kids who climbed into a woman's lap. Next to her sat a man with the butt of a revolver sticking out of his belt line. This no longer drew my attention in any special manner. Water still stood 2 feet deep in many streets, enough so that the motorcycles with sidecars, the second favorite public transport, made spectacular fantails while careering around corners. This had become a sport a few days earlier on the Feast of John the Baptist, when Filipino youth are licensed to douse all unsuspecting adults. The jeepney headed down Magsaysay, stopping for new passengers and dropping off others. We made our way past a string of clubs where the girls were standing outside, eating their morning noodles, while inside, electrified music could already be heard. The jeepney driver's attention was gotten with the usual perfected by Filipinos, produced by sharply exhaling air across the top and bottom of the tongue, held near but not against the front teeth, and employed everywhere for greeting, warning, and beckonings, both well-mannered and impudent. The end of the line was the gate to the U.S. Naval Base at Subic Bay, just on the other side of the Olongapo River. The sailors referred to the water, the color and nearly the consistency of crankcase oil, as the shit river. This didn't keep Filipino boys from swimming in it at every hour, enticing sailors on the bridge to throw them coins, which they deftly fished from the black water to cash in their mouths. I wondered about the melange of parasites this must have introduced to their guts. The base command had reportedly forbidden this coin tossing, but no one paid heed. Dan had told me something about Ramon Magsaysay. He distinguished himself by standing with MacArthur during the Japanese occupation. He then became president of the Philippines when independence was gained after the war. Magsaysay was generally acceptable on Philippine nationalism, that is, the country's resistance to colonial domination. Not as outstanding, mind you, as José Rizal, the great 19th century patriot, novelist, poet, and physician, or even close to the die-hard rebel Bonifacio, who fought on guerrilla fashion after the Spanish had arranged an amiable transfer to the Americans at the end of the Spanish-American War. The point of this litany was a hierarchy of patriotism, descending to the current quisling Ferdinand Marcos. By agreement, Lieutenant Peter Chernoff, a friendly Navy Defense Counsel, was standing at the gate to sponsor me aboard. The guards had authority to search my luggage, but with the lieutenant in his dress white uniform, they decided I was probably not smuggling anything. It was normally items going out the gate and into the bustling black market, for which they were on the lookout. The intention was to take me to the Navy's heliport, where Peter hoped I could snag unofficial transportation to Manila. The idea was never well formulated and probably had no likelihood of success. It was Saturday morning, and the numbers interested in getting to Manila had swelled. Like myself, they knew the roads were almost impassable, and the journey would take many more hours than usual. My full red beard and civilian clothes drew unwanted attention to any military pilot who might have been willing to insert me onto his manifest. I stood in line for over 60 minutes, not getting close to slipping onto the departing choppers, before we decided the outlook was unpromising. We returned to the curb where Peter had parked his MG, magically conveyed to the PI courtesy of the U.S. Navy. I wedged my oversized baggage into the small trunk and behind the bucket seats, and Peter drove in the direction of QB Point. This had been the locus of my last case at the law center. Our judge was the same lieutenant commander who had heard one of Kapansky's trials in Vietnam, a notable trial in which a GI named Ned Posey from Lead, North Dakota, had disobeyed an order from his commander to get a regulation haircut. Not only did the charge make interesting copy for a media corps that had decided the war was less interesting than the GI's attitude about it, but it also produced some fallout. A keen-eyed reporter observed that when he testified, the officer who gave the haircut order to Posey was wearing non-regulation footwear with chrome buckles. And, after a sentence amounting to a mild rebuke, the general who convened the trial had decreed the military judge henceforth to be persona non grata on his base. This led LMDC to call for an embarrassing investigation. One, however, which the judge probably welcomed, though he hadn't sought his approval. Frenchie, the 19-year-old Cajun charged with aiding and abetting a theft of munitions from the QB Point magazine, where he had been a sentry, was the kind of client lawyers appreciate. You try to spend as much time with them before trial as possible, scheduling appointments to come in and talk about nothing in particular. The objective is to get to know them so well in the brief time leading up to the hearing that you will sense how they will answer any question, no matter how unexpected. This means you want to learn what kind of cars they drive. Do they like to double date? How do they feel about their siblings? What plans do they have after the service? What do they think about soul music? Do they watch Laugh-In? Did they play high school sports? From this, the solutions to 2 trial problems are supposed to emerge. Whether the person should testify in the case, and will the client trust the lawyer enough to place his faith in the attorney's hands? Sometimes you have no choice. Once, during a probation revocation hearing, I was obliged to place a strange and violent man on the witness stand to deny he had cracked the jaw of his longtime girlfriend. He described the evening at her apartment in even tones, until he mentioned the young woman's insistence on watching a goddamn Star Trek rerun for the fucking millionth time. He thus demonstrated to all in the courtroom an utter incapacity to appreciate Star Trek aficionados as a social phenomenon. Whatever difficulty the judge might have had resolving the conflicting testimony over the alleged assault also vanished. Frenchie was different. Lawyers work with the advantage they're given in a case, however slight. I decided Frenchie was the best thing going in his own defense. On the night of the theft, he was a bit player in a complex scheme involving a string of Filipinos and Navy enlisted men. Yes, he was crucial in the actual larceny, since he had stood by in silence while the removal took place. But the $50 U.S. currency he'd received came from a chief petty officer, paymaster to the group of involved sailors, ending with the guards at the main gate, who had permitted the contraband-laden truck to leave without inspection. The Naval Investigative Service had broken the case, and 7 members of the U.S. Navy faced charges of conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The Filipinos, known only by the common first names of Lito, June, short for the first name Junior, and Danny, had blended into the scenery. The hardship faced by Frenchie was that, although he was the initial link in the chain, he was the last in the line of finger-pointing. Each of the others named in the now-busted conspiracy had made an agreement with the trial counsel to testify against my client. They had rushed either to gain outright immunity or make sweetheart provisos with the prosecution guaranteeing light sentences in exchange for their testimony. If the judge advocate who recommended these deals, or the admiral convening the court-martial who approved them, saw any incongruity in the arrangements, they showed no sign of it. There was, however, the distinct likelihood that given the number and character of the witnesses, the prosecution would overtry its case. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but the greater the number of prosecution witnesses, the higher the chance something unwanted will develop. Even if testimony has to do with matters inconsequential, it can, depending on the situation, wind up making a negative impression on the trier of fact. I kept this in mind as I interviewed the sailors who were lining up to make Frenchie the scapegoat. Unlike the young Cajun, who had arrived in Subic Bay only 3 weeks before being drawn into the misadventure, his accusers were seasoned hands in the ways and means of the Philippine black market. It had to be brought out that they were getting off lightly, though they were guilty of much more, while Frenchie was supposed to take a heavy sentence for a single deed. It was a strain keeping my attention on Frenchie's case. I had a reservation on a flight out of Manila in a few days. If the trial lasted 2 days, I would have no difficulty, but there could always be unanticipated delays. And even getting to Manila, I knew, would be a major hurdle. With my load of baggage, the Philippine Rabbit didn't seem like a practical alternative. Eventually, Lieutenant Chernoff suggested getting from Subic to the capital by air. If that didn't work, I might miss the flight home, a prospect I didn't wish to contemplate. In the meantime, I labored on Frenchie's case, and in the evenings tried to tire myself out at the Kung Tao Academy, where Dan and Barbara had introduced me. Kung Tao is simply the Philippines version of Kung Fu, but that's misleading, since Filipino style is not like any other martial art. In its own way, it's a form of dance, hypnotically rhythmic and graceful. The Kung Tao master and owner of the school had a map in his tiny office with colored pins marking the sequence of branches he would open once he fulfilled his worldwide ambitions. After I'd arrived from Saigon, Barbara took me with her to the classes, and though I was awkward and not nearly as limber as she and the other students, I happily started attending the hour-long sessions each evening. The room we used was poorly lit and damp. It never had sufficient mats to pad our falls, but the sessions were an oasis. Vietnam had nothing like it for me as a serene refuge, a place where people were decent and respectful to one another. We addressed each other as Kyud for men, Kyudai for women. We learned from a physically gifted artist. When Kyud Lito sparred with his advanced pupils, onlookers would gather. He was a wisp of a man of undetermined middle age. He did not weigh 100 pounds, but his movements were lethal gossamer. Against hulking opponents more than twice his size, usually bouncers in the local casinos, whose base stance was like Ramsey's pyramid, Lito flicked wrists, elbows, and insteps. First, his adversary feigned indifference to such a mosquito, but gradually, a tug here, a pull there by Lito, and the bigger man was lunging. And with each ever more futile attempt to bring Lito down, his antagonist became more vulnerable, inevitably toppling to the mat, where Lito would deliver the coup de grace, a theatrical hand chop to the throat, say, or a crushing elbow to the temple. Lito let there be no doubt that his students were instructed in a deadly art, nor was there any argument that it was not to be used aggressively. The first words he spoke to every new student, including me, were, "Kung Tao is a method of self-defense. Running is also a good form of self-defense." I practiced my katas, or forms, diligently, and after almost 3 months became proficient enough to gain a green belt, though it was likely a gesture midway between flattery and humor, a bit of Lito's hopeful salesmanship promoting, perhaps, the spread of his branches to the U.S. I didn't care about his motivation. At a small ceremony, Dan, Barbara, and I proudly cinched our white cotton G's with new Kelly green belts. Lito even invited us to accompany his team to Manila for a competition as spectators. Then, with my last week nearing, money began disappearing from my locker while I was engaged in the instruction. I wanted to complain, but Barbara said it would be pointless. Whenever we sat down together, Frenchie addressed me as Sir. This conflicted with our practiced efforts to create a new set of relations with our clients. So I said, make it Howard. But Frenchie never took me up. Though I was barely 30, he would behave toward an elder the way his mama and daddy had taught. He would also continue to wedge a mid-sized wad of tobacco between his cheek and his gum in the manner he'd learned in Louisiana's accordion and cypress country. It revolted me, but I said nothing, except that he was not to appear with it in court. Over several of our sessions, I developed a presentation emphasizing how Frenchie had made his first acquaintances at Subic Bay. The other sentries had been involved in the theft ring for several months. If they were to be his natural companions, he would be part of their ring. He was 19, overseas for the first time, and knew no one else. The contrast between Frenchie and his newfound pals would be striking. A couple of them had gone bamboo, the local expression for adopting the Filipino modus operandi. It usually meant marrying a local woman who then furnished the links needed to flourish in the black market. If the misfortune of getting caught occurred, which was a recognized occupational hazard, the risks were minimal. That is, with the timely intervention of the fiscal, the municipal prosecuting attorney. Under the compact between the U.S. Navy and the government of the Philippines, if the fiscal placed a legal hold on any U.S. military member, then that person could not be transferred beyond the local jurisdiction. This clause proved to be an avenue for long-term tenure. On the payment of a modest bribe, the fiscal could be induced to instigate a briar patch proceeding against someone whose last wish was to leave the PI. The trusted pretext was a suit for defamation, which is a quasi-criminal matter under the Spanish statutory law still in use. Months of litigation before the local juez would turn into years. Meanwhile, base commanders and their judge advocates were reassigned. With luck, people would forget what all the fuss had been about. It was a notorious situation that no one knew quite how to solve. A number of black marketeers were sitting pretty and untouchable in the ranks of the Navy's petty officers at Subic. A couple of them were in the cast of characters prepared to testify against Frenchie. Going bamboo involves choices. Somewhere in the mix is a decision not to go back to whatever was left behind in the U.S. So there's disappointment and sadness beneath the layers of Filipino wife, kids, and black marketeering, or drugs, or prostitution, or all three. If I had been defending someone gone bamboo, I would bring out what it was that brought about the abandonment of the Navy's trust. It might be racism or poverty or a bad family, some failure of the good life promised in the States. But on Frenchie's behalf, I couldn't dwell on such matters. I stressed the betrayal of trust side of the equation. Had it occurred to you, petty officer, now in your third tour at Subic, that this youth from Louisiana hardly knew his way from one end of Magsaysay to the other when you invited him to join your larcenous club? And did you feel any responsibility as someone older, wiser, higher in rank, and more experienced in the ways of the Philippines to steer this young man away from the local hazards? I didn't want to mention by name the Cagayan, the vessel intercepted in recent weeks delivering weapons to the Maoist New People's Army, in case the military jurors hadn't read about it, but most likely they had, so I tiptoed around the difficulty. Do you think he had any awareness of the destination of the various items taken from the magazine, the grenades, the flares, the large caliber cartridges? Or, unlike you, was he too wet behind the ears to have any idea? I received the answers I wanted to each question, and after finishing, I put Frenchie on the witness stand and asked him a few brief questions. It would then be trial counsel's decision whether to cross-examine him roughly. I figured either way would be a losing proposition for the prosecutor. If he concluded nothing could be gained, then the contrast between the naive sailor and the seasoned conspirators stood unchallenged. If he thought he could make Frenchie look like something else, I expected trial counsel would simply underscore what a feckless lad he had on his hands. He must have sensed this too and declined to ask any questions. The 5 members deliberated quickly. They convicted Frenchie of the lesser offense of dereliction of duty, gave him 3 months in the brig, reduced him in rank, but agreed he could return to duty. Lieutenant Chernoff decided to drive toward QB Point because of the civil airstrip, where the Navy had authorized a flying club to operate. Especially on weekends, small private aircraft were constantly taking off and landing, novice pilots and hobbyists honing their skills. Peter thought it might be possible to find someone with an empty passenger seat willing to fly me to Manila. A glance at the sky suggested a 45-minute hop could end up racing a gathering cloudburst. Before long, we saw a light plane taxiing toward the shed where we stood. Sure enough, a Filipino pilot was ferrying someone in from Manila. Unfortunately, there were 2 men ahead of me. It was almost 2 in the afternoon. I would have to wait. Peter told me he had to deal with some errands. He thought I'd be all right, but he checked back in a couple of hours. After 90 minutes passed, I saw the plane on the runway again. Another potential passenger had joined me in the meantime. We had a quick discussion with the pilot. I didn't like the clouds building up to the north, and agreed on $25 apiece to cover the fuel. The only problem was weight. The pilot thought, with my luggage, he was over the limit. I had a choice, he said, without being harsh. You can fly with me now and leave your bags. If I can, I'll bring them on my next swing. Or you can wait with your bags and I'll pick you up and the bags on my next trip. I looked at the sky and decided to leave my bags on the tarmac. How badly did I want to leave? To get back to San Francisco? To join my wife and girls? To eat a decent meal? To see whether I could shake the infection in my big toe? To get dry? To be rid of the thieving? To come out of a year in Vietnam and the Philippines a survivor? Awfully bad, I guess. I certainly knew that I might not see the bags again, that they stood a good chance of not being there even if the pilot made a final trip. And, assuming the rain held off long enough, the bags lying on the ground probably couldn't outbid one last paying customer. Nonetheless, I sat in the flight controller's office in Manila the required 90 minutes to see whether they would make it. The pilot proved an honorable man and received a second $25 for his virtue. A taxi carried the suitcases and me directly to the Intercontinental Hotel in Makati. My sense of triumph and a credit card entitled me to some comfort. Later, feeling celebratory, I went into downtown Manila. First, I wagered a few dollars worth of pesos on the matches at the High Life Fronton. I then set off to find a theater showing Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dynamite, starring James Coburn as an Irish revolutionary, hooked up with Pancho Villa's guerrillas. During one of her DGs, Melinda had advised that it correctly portrayed righteous proletarian violence.